that he could go to the Russian people and talk about, we have Crimea, but of course they've had Crimea since 2014. He could make the argument they've got parts of Donetsk, as well as Zaporizhia and Kherson. They've got almost all of Luhansk. And he can make the argument that they have gained this territory and that they're not going to suffer punishment for it because they are going to have the sanctions lifted. They're going to have membership of the G8 again. They're going to get some power from the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant because of the proposal that it be under IAEA control. And I can see how Putin can present it to the Russian people, that even at the cost of well over 1 million casualties, I think we're close to 1.3 million now, that they've gotten something. And importantly, he could make the argument, we no longer have to make the sacrifices of a wartime economy for that. He could make that argument. I'm not sure he wants to make that argument. I still come back to a fundamental here. Vladimir Putin launched the full-scale invasion in 2022 because he wanted to break Ukraine. He wanted to make Ukraine part of a greater Russia. Even if part of Ukraine remained supposedly as an independent country, it would be under a government that Putin chose, possibly under Mr. Medvedchuk. Well, he didn't get that. But he still wants to get more than what he has right now. And the tip-off is that demand for all of Donetsk. Because, first of all, it means that they can make the claim to the Russian people, we've got all of the Donbass. Look, this is our victory. But secondly, you can always use that as a launch pad for another invasion. You can always use that to put pressure back on what remains of Ukraine, especially if you have other terms such as no foreign troops allowed in Ukraine, no significant U.S. security guarantee. So no, I don't think it's a question of if Putin can sell this to the Russian people right now, because I don't think Putin wants to sell it to the Russian people. I don't think he wants to accept it. That's what we come down to. And we'll have the tip-off. Look, if the Kremlin will not agree to a ceasefire this week, next week, the week after that, we know they're not willing to stop. And it comes down to what we've talked about on previous programs. How do you force Russia to stop? Yes, the Kremlin can agree to Trump's plan because it's not Trump's plan, it's their plan. I must emphasize this because I've seen some analysts come out and insist, no, this is the U.S. plan, it must be the U.S. plan. It's not true. Christo Grozev, who's a very good investigative journalist, saw a copy of the plan that is from this spring. It had 30 points in it. 2 of them were omitted in the later draft. I'll leave that to the side for the moment. But the fundamentals in that 28-point plan that showed up at the end of October, so several months later, were there in the spring. And the reason why the Kremlin could accept their own plan is for a few reasons. One is they get Donetsk, they get all of Donetsk, and it is quite clear that that has become the Kremlin's focus. They're not going to be able to conquer all of Ukraine. They have to accept that some of Ukraine still remains free. They're not going to be able to take all of Kherson and Zaporizhia. They just don't have the leverage to do that. But they want to get de facto recognition of Crimea, the part of Kherson and Zaporizhia they hold, and they want all of Donetsk, and they want legal recognition. That's interesting that in the 28-point plan, it doesn't say de facto recognition of Russia holding Donetsk. It's legal recognition that this is Russian territory. So that's the first thing that they want. The second thing that they want is they want to keep Ukraine militarily weak. So they put the cap on Ukraine's armed forces at 600,000 troops. That gives Russia already a 4-to-1 advantage in terms of manpower. They restrict the Western military assistance that Ukraine can get. That gives Russia almost a permanent superiority in terms of equipment on the air and in the ground. And then thirdly, they get to come back into the international community like nothing happened, like there was no aggression. They get to come back into the G8. They get to come back with the sanctions lifted. And the tip-off that this was Kremlin playing to the Americans is that more than Donald Trump being pro-Kremlin, Donald Trump wants to make money. And so the first clause to pay attention to is that the frozen Russian assets, which Europe holds, of course, is that these would be used not just for Ukraine's reconstruction, it would be for Ukraine to give money to the US in so-called profits. And secondly, that in exchange for any security guarantee, Ukraine must compensate, or Ukraine or someone on Ukraine's behalf must compensate the Americans. They have to pay the Americans to provide the security guarantee. That's playing to Trump's idea as a businessman. I have to make money out of this. Ukraine security, that's secondary. Europe security, secondary. I have to make money. And the Kremlin knew that, because ask yourself, who was the key Kremlin advisor who pushed the plan? Kirill Dmitriev. Why is that important? First of all, Kirill Dmitriev, formerly head of Russia's Sovereign Wealth Fund. He has been around for many years. Initially, he was supposed to try to get Western investment into the post-Soviet Russia. Didn't do well with that, but he got Gulf money into the post-Soviet Russia. Kirill Dmitriev, at the start of 2017, before Donald Trump was inaugurated, met Donald Trump's people, specifically the Blackwater mercenary Eric Prince. He met him in Mauritius to establish a back channel between the Kremlin and Washington to talk about political and economic deals, political and economic interest. Dmitriev has been working with the Trump camp for almost 9 years, and possibly even longer than that. That was the Kremlin's play, is we're going to get the Trump people to accept this plan and to push it on Ukraine, but we're going to pretend that it's a US plan. That's where we are.
Let's also cover interesting editorial by the Washington Post by David Ignatius. I read that yesterday, probably morning, and the question still remains open. Would Vladimir Putin be able to sell even such a deal to the Russian people? Because Russians have suffered more than 1 million casualties, dead and wounded, and Russians, according to the Washington Post, might ask the question, was this fight worth it, right? Was this worth it? And was this deal worth it? So from your perspective, is Vladimir Putin ready for this post-war scenario, even if he at some point in the future or in the nearest future would agree with such Trump's plan on Ukraine or on better version?
That's a really interesting editorial, because David Ignatius, who I've read for 30 years, is very, very close to people in the State Department. He always has been close to State Department. And my reading of that is that Ignatius was putting forth the lines of people in the State Department, including those around Marco Rubio, in terms of, okay, here's why Ukraine should accept a deal of some version, because eventually it's going to put pressure on Vladimir Putin, right? Now, that Ignatius editorial was not saying that Ukraine should accept the Trump Kremlin proposals. It was saying that Ukraine needs to accept some type of alternative or revised version of those proposals. And this is the short-term versus long-term argument, which is that in the short term, Ukraine is going to have to give up quite a bit. It's going to have to give up the territory that Russia occupies. It's going to have to accept that for the foreseeable future, it cannot join NATO. It's going to have to accept that it faces quite a bit of a challenge with reconstruction and recovery. But it's saying Ukraine should accept that, because in the longer term, a stronger Ukraine can prevail, even as Russia continues to have serious issues. We can debate whether or not that's a valid point of view or one that we can accept. I mean, I've got mixed feelings about it. The fundamental for me is the signal that Ignatius editorial sent. And again, the signal was coming out of the Rubio camp, which was don't necessarily think that Ukraine don't necessarily think that you have to accept the Trump Kremlin proposal. Don't think you have to do that, but do be willing to negotiate. Do be willing to show that you're willing to establish a settlement here, which is exactly where we are. As we were back in the spring, as we were in the summer, we're back to the point where Vladimir Zelensky and the Europeans have got to work on Trump. They've got to work on his ego. They've got to flatter him. And in the meantime, get to the adults in the room, those people in the Trump administration who realize you cannot just simply surrender to Moscow.
But I will also, to get us back to this interesting question, can Vladimir Putin really sell this to the Russian people if he agrees with Trump's plan on Ukraine or any kind of other addition of such roadmap to peace?
I trying to get into Vladimir Putin's head. You could make the argument that he could go to the Russian people and talk about, we have Crimea, but of course they've had Crimea since 2014. He could make the argument they've got parts of Donetsk as well as Zaporizhia and Kherson. They've got almost all of Luhansk. And he can make the argument that they have gained this territory and that they're not going to suffer punishment for it because they are going to have the sanctions lifted. They're going to have membership of the G8 again. They're going to get some power from the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant because of the proposal that it be under IAEA control. And I can see how Putin can present it to the Russian people, that even at the cost of well over 1 million casualties, I think we're close to 1.3 million now, that they've gotten something. And importantly, he could make the argument we no longer have to make the sacrifices of a wartime economy for that. He could make that argument. I'm not sure he wants to make that argument. I still come back to a fundamental here. Vladimir Putin launched the full-scale invasion in 2022 because he wanted to break Ukraine. He wanted to make Ukraine part of a greater Russia. Even if part of Ukraine remained supposedly as an independent country, it would be under a government that Putin chose, possibly under Mr. Medvedchuk. Well, he didn't get that. But he still wants to get more than what he has right now. And the tip-off is that demand for all of Donetsk. Because, first of all, it means that they can make the claim to the Russian people, we've got all of the Donbass. Look, this is our victory. But secondly, you can always use that as a launch pad for another invasion. You can always use that to put pressure back on what remains of Ukraine, especially if you have other terms such as no foreign troops allowed in Ukraine, no significant U.S. security guarantee. So no, I don't think it's a question of if Putin can sell this to the Russian people right now, because I don't think Putin wants to sell it to the Russian people. I don't think he wants to accept it. That's what we come down to. And we'll have the tip-off. Look, if the Kremlin will not agree to a ceasefire this week, next week, the week after that, we know they're not willing to stop. And it comes down to what we've talked about on previous programs. How do you force Russia to stop? The cost has to be so great for Putin, has to be so great that it outweighs his personal dream of breaking Ukraine. And that means, and this was made clear by President Zelensky, it was made clear by European leaders, you have to maintain the economic pressure on Russia, and you have to hold out the possibility that there'll be expanded Ukrainian counterattacks on Russian territory.
But don't you feel that recent sanctions against Rosneft and Lukoil were really harmful for Russian economy and also foreign assets of these two companies that were probably completely destroyed abroad? Could this at least, compel Vladimir Putin to try to think about this way out, because he can reach a so pro-Russian deal with Trump as never before? He couldn't do that with President Biden. Don't you think that he would not have any kind of other chance to do so in the future?
I think you've summarized this well. I mean, look, here's a fundamental. Sometimes aggressors issue an ultimatum not from a position of strength, but from a position of possible weakness. Because of the economic pressure on Russia, which includes those U.S. sanctions. And you'll notice that amidst all the threats on the Trump Kremlin plan this week, that nobody said that the U.S. is going to lift those sanctions in the near future. Because of that economic pressure, because Ukraine has raised questions for the Kremlin, because of the ability to hit the oil refineries, to hit the chemical plants, the petrochemical complexes, the engineering plants, the railway hubs, the ports, because of the stalling of the Russian economy, and because even with its vast amount of manpower, Russia's taken these serious casualties. I have said, I think you're looking at, this could be the fact that Russia has a 6 to 12 month window to try to break Ukraine. Well, what if they can't break Ukraine militarily? What do? You try to break them politically and diplomatically. And that's where the timing comes into play. And I just want to, if you have a minute, just remind your viewers of a couple of key things that happened, because a lot of the media just haven't put it all together. On the 16th of October, Vladimir Putin, who's very, very worried about the American sanctions, calls Donald Trump and says, look, let's discuss this. Let's work this through. I'm sure we can find a way to resolve this. The day after that, Trump goes into a meeting with President Zelensky, and in a foul-mouthed rant, he's really in a bad mood. He's effectively saying, why won't you settle? Why won't you agree? And Steve Witkoff is saying, why won't you give Donetsk to the Russians? But Zelensky holds his ground on October 17th. And at the end of that meeting, Trump says, okay, we need to stop the fighting on the basis of the current front lines. Okay? See exactly where we are. Kremlin's in a really bad position here because the U.S. sanctions are going to proceed and the front lines might be frozen. That's when Kirill Dmitriev goes to the United States. At the time when Dmitriev went to the United States in the following week, which is the last week of October, we thought it was a failed trip. He did a couple of interviews on US TV that did not go very well. People in Congress were really upset that he seemed to be pushing this Russian hard line. What we didn't know at the time is that the meeting that he wanted didn't take place in Washington. It took place in Miami, Florida. That's where he met Witkoff. And that's where Witkoff agreed to push the deal with him. From a position of weakness, the Russians had a moment where they had gotten Witkoff effectively to be their water boy, to carry their proposal forward. Here we are, and you and I are now talking on November the 24th. And that Kremlin attempt from weakness, which succeeded in the short run by recruiting Witkoff, by having Jared Kushner on board, by getting the support of J.D. Vance, now will that attempt from weakness succeed and save Vladimir Putin? Or can Ukraine and Europe, working with others like Marco Rubio, push it back? I think the latter is going to happen. I don't like making predictions. I think the latter is going to happen. And when the Trump Kremlin proposal is not accepted, when Putin does not get Donetsk, when he does not get a guarantee that Ukraine will not join NATO, when he doesn't get that, where's his position of strength to try to attack again?
So can we say that this the most impossible part of peace plan? I mean, ceding Donbass to Russia. So without this without this, basically, do you think that Russia will never agree to a peace plan, any ceasefire, anything?
I don't think, I can't see Putin agreeing to a ceasefire for the foreseeable future. And so I think let's take it back to where we are, because you speak to me in Ukraine, and we started off by talking about President Zelensky talking about one of the most difficult moments. I think we have to realize that Russia, not from a position of overwhelming strength, but because it has this time frame, is going to continue to try to advance in Donetsk, even though they still have not taken Pokrovsk, and still fighting goes on there. They are going to try to advance in Zaporizhia, where they've made some limited gains. So they're going to try to take some territory on the ground. So can Ukraine get support in resisting that and holding that back? I will mention, and you can help me out with this, I understand that the weather in Ukraine is not as foggy as it was a couple of weeks ago, which means it'll be more difficult for the Russians to advance, because Ukrainian drones can operate much more better when the fog has lifted. From the air, with regret, I think you can expect more Russian missile and drone strikes, terror strikes. I think 4 people were killed in Kharkiv overnight, for example. We know that there were the attacks on Kyiv just over a week ago. I think you can expect, of course, further Russian propaganda that Ukraine is the barrier to peace, that it's Ukraine which is to blame for everything. We know that that is going to occur. We know that Russia will continue to try to split European support, especially trying to use Hungary's Viktor Orban to do this. But we know at the same time, and we know that Russia will continue to try to break Ukraine's energy infrastructure, which you have had to face. That has been a serious issue, with the loss of about 50 to 60% of the generating capacity at certain times. But we know that Ukraine has gotten additional commitments of support to assist the energy infrastructure, for example, from Greece last week. We know that the European Union has said that there will be further financial support, although we need to establish how they're going to use the frozen Russian assets. We know that the European Union has not stopped supporting Ukraine diplomatically. That's what we saw in Geneva. And we know that some Americans, some members of the Trump administration, do not want to abandon Ukraine. So yes, Vladimir Putin is going to continue to try to break you. But the fundamental question comes down to this. Do Ukrainian people want to be broken? As long as Ukrainian people think that this is a resistance which is worthwhile, I think they will get sufficient support so that while they realize this is going to continue, this invasion is going to continue, they realize that this does not mean their surrender. And then we probably will have to go into, I suspect the key period will probably be coming out of the winter in early 2026, which is, are we at a point then when Russia might stop?